So if you're just joining us, we have been walking through 1 Corinthians in the New Testament. And 1 Corinthians, it's a letter. It's written by a man named the Apostle Paul, who was formerly a persecutor of Jesus, completely disagreed that Jesus was the Messiah, and went out to persecute, imprison, even kill his followers. And then he had this unexplainable experience where God came to him as he was journeying to imprison some more followers of Jesus. He thought he was following God and doing the right thing. He was a very zealous Jew, and he was abiding by the Old Testament every way he knew how and following these different instructions and laws that God had laid out. But he saw a blinding light, and in that light, Jesus spoke to him from heaven, and that changed his course. And whether or not you believe his experience is up to you, but whatever happened, a dramatic thing happened to this man who was set out to oppose the followers of Jesus, believed Jesus was a fraud and a sham, and he turned into somebody who would go through tortures and shipwrecks and difficulties and struggles and imprisonment and death for this Jesus that he used to persecute. And so whatever happened, something amazing happened to Paul. And so he took the message of Jesus all throughout the Roman Empire to different cities. And one of the cities that he stopped in was a city called Corinth, and it's in Greece, right in the middle where the Peloponnesus, the south part of Greece, and the mainland kind of meet on this small section of land called an isthmus. That's where Corinth was. And we've talked about ancient Corinth. It's a unique town because people there could come and make a name for themselves at a time when you normally had to have some connections. You had to be born into the right families in Rome to have any kind of leadership or ability to advance in society, but not so in the city of Corinth. It was a Greek city, and Rome came in and demolished it about 146 BC, and then about 100 years later, they decided, we're going to rebuild this mess that we made of Corinth, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to invite people from all over the Roman Empire who are committed to the ways of Rome, but a lot of people who used to be slaves even. We're going to give them an opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work their way up to the top in society. So it's very competitive, but there was a lot of opportunity there in an empire where many places provided no opportunity. And so that same competition to try to get ahead in society and make a name for yourself worked its way into the church culture. And a lot of the believers and followers of Jesus at Corinth had this idea that if you want to be a good follower of Jesus, you also need to compete with one another in a church environment. You need to work to get ahead. You need to rise above the rest, and comparing yourselves with other people and putting down people is completely fine because that's how you get ahead in the world. Maybe you hear some similarities with the way people talk or think today. And so we're going to step into that discussion. We're a few weeks in. Today we're talking about, and the whole series really talks about honor versus humility. It's Paul speaking into the culture that just totally dominates the way that Corinthian people think. I mean, they've been immersed in it. A lot of them have grown up in this city, and they just think about competition and getting ahead. And Paul's going to reach in and take the truth about who God is from the Bible to really challenge the way that they think. And above everything else, he's going to bring up this image of Jesus hanging on the cross. And he's going to say, if God is really about status and achievements and your connections and your politics and how hard you work and how much wealth you have, like society says life is about, if God really has the same philosophy, why in the world would he come as a human and die a shameful death on a cross that everyone in the Roman Empire would shudder at? Everyone realizes crosses are for criminals. Crosses are about shaming those who are being executed. So why would God do something so shameful? And Paul says you need to think about that. Maybe God's mind works totally different than your mind works as humans. So we've been investigating that. Last week we talked about spiritual maturity. We'll review a little bit of that in just a moment. But what are some signs that people are spiritually mature? It might not be what the Corinthians would automatically assume being spiritually mature would be about. And today we're going to kind of piggyback off of that to talk about humility in a broader sense. I want to call this the two sides of humility today. I don't want to kind of envision a coin, because coins have two sides, right? And so when I see what Paul is addressing today, I see him presenting two sides of a coin of humility, because the Corinthians lack humility. And I think all along, Paul is trying to drive them to the realization that if you want to be mature in your faith, you need to be humble. And that has two different aspects. One of those aspects is not boasting about yourself. So don't think more highly of yourselves than you should. I think that's what he would be saying directly to the Corinthians, essentially. Don't think more highly of yourselves than you should. It's not about boasting about how great you are. On the other hand, it's not about judging other people too. And it's not about thinking of yourself more highly, and it's not about thinking about other people less highly. It's about thinking of yourself humbly and about really exalting, in a sense, other people and valuing other people, which was, again, the exact opposite of the direction that the Corinthians were headed at this point in time. So we're going to look at those two different aspects, not boasting and not judging. Not judging is interesting because, one, Jesus says it a lot. Paul says it in Romans. There's a lot of places in the Bible that tell us not to judge. However, in 1 Corinthians 5, which we'll get to in maybe 3 or 4 more weeks, there is an area where Paul tells the church in Corinth that they do need to judge. And so we get into maybe some exceptions. There might be a couple of cases where, as a church community, we do need to exercise judgment, in a sense. But as a default, many of us default on judging, right? It's just a human nature kind of thing to do. But I think Paul would say, if you're going to be humble, default on assessing yourself, not judging people, and default on a humble opinion of yourself, not boasting about how great you are and comparing yourselves with others. So I could pretty much stop there and we'd be done and we'd gain something this morning. But we're going to walk through Paul's conversation and see how he presents it to the Corinthian followers of Jesus this morning. We're going to start in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 18, and work through chapter 4, verse 7 this morning. And this is how Paul starts out. He continues that conversation about spiritual maturity by saying, "Take care that no one deceives himself or herself. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, he must become foolish so that he may become wise." And if you sat with us through some of these teachings on Sunday morning in 1 Corinthians the last several weeks, you've heard the words wise and foolish come up a lot. It's almost like Paul is driving this conversation into the ground over and over again on repeat because he realizes the Corinthians just don't get it. And it's like if I explain this to you 5 or 6 different ways, maybe it's going to get through. It's going to make a difference. And the idea is the Corinthians, they have been trying to measure themselves against their culture's standards of wisdom. What does our society say is wise? We're trying to live up to that and importing that into our understanding of what God thinks, is wise. And Paul is saying, don't deceive yourselves because God has a whole different definition of wisdom. You're operating on human nature's definition of wisdom, and God wants you to operate on his wavelength of wisdom. And so you almost have to unlearn everything that society has taught you about wisdom and then allow God to build up your concept and your definition of wisdom from the ground up. And so again, what did their culture think about wisdom? What were their standards? And here's just a review. We've talked about these concepts before. If you have the right connections with people, then you're wise. If you have wealth, then surely you're wise. That's how you got wealthy. If you have property, land, or a nice home, you're wise because you use that wisdom to acquire that stuff. If you're in charge, you're in a leadership position, you're a city official, people look up to you and you make decisions, then you're wise because your wisdom got you to that place. If you're disciplined, if you're a stoic philosopher and you're in control of all of your emotions, you have extreme self-control, then you're wise. Or like the Epicureans, if you're happy, like you know what makes you happy, what brings you pleasure, and what brings you pain, and you've been successful at avoiding the pain and maximizing the happy in your life, you're wise because your life is good, it's enjoyable, it's luxurious. And that's their standard of wisdom. And as we think about those things, that sounds kind of familiar to a lot of the ways that we are drawn to think in our society, right? I mean, if you were to write a list of people who were wise out there, how many people on your list would be people with the right connections? Or maybe in our culture, more commonly, people with wealth, right? Those wise people we look up to, a lot of them might have money or property. Wise people would probably have some kind of position of leadership. or authority. Wise people would probably be perceived as disciplined, and they probably would be happy people. You don't pick a lot of depressed people out, and say, oh, they're wise, they're struggling. But again, that's the human perception. And God's definition of wisdom is going to be totally different. And we know this because, again, Paul has just talked about this group's maturity as far as God's wisdom and their spiritual maturity. We talked about that last week. And here's what we discovered. In reality, this group of people who think they're super wise, they actually lack discernment. They're not good at discerning things and listening to God's Spirit and understanding God's revealed truth in the Bible that you can't just come to logically. They're also at a place where they need people to feed them simple, clear teachings. If you got into a complex discussion about something that was difficult, maybe it was a concept about God or answering a tough question, they would just kind of devolve into arguing with each other and get in fights. They couldn't handle that kind of depth yet. They want just simple, clear stuff. And Paul's like, if you were so wise, why do you need milk? You're not ready to eat solid food. In reality, there are people who are competing and they're fighting and they're taking sides. Kind of like toddlers throwing a tantrum. Like that's their mode of operation commonly. Competing, I'm on this team, you're on that team, I'm better than you are, no, I'm better than you are, and there's fights all the time. And if they were truly wise, would that be the way that their life was operating? In reality, they're consuming rather than contributing. They're happy to let Paul and Apollos and these other leaders do lots of work to serve them, and they're just happy with being the field and the building. We'll let other people build us up brick by brick, and we'll let other people do all the planting work in us, and we'll just receive it. We're the field. We're passive. We'll just sit back. And Paul's saying, you're not as wise as you think you are. Then he says in verse 19, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness in the sight of God. So the way that your society thinks, its definition of wisdom, like God's like, that's not where wisdom is at. You need to relearn God's wisdom is what he's telling them. And then he tells them some things about God's wisdom and how it operates, about 5 different things in the next few phrases. The first thing he does is he quotes a passage in the Old Testament. He quotes 2 places in this. The first is from the book of Job, chapter 5, and the second one is in Psalm 94. And I'll talk about kind of what those passages are about, but we're not going to delve into the depths of those this morning. But the first thing Paul says when he's saying, like, you need to relearn God's wisdom, he says, it's written in the Old Testament of the Bible, in the book of Job, God, is the one who catches the wise by their craftiness. So he says, God has this tendency to frustrate the plans of really clever people who have these schemes to get ahead in the world. How can I put other people down? And how can I make myself look better? How can I benefit at another person's expense? Oh, I came up with such a great idea. I'm going to make it big, make lots of money, get lots of prominence or power. I figured out how to do this and how to take advantage of people well. And that was kind of the way that the Corinthians, like they would have thought that was a step up. Like, oh, you came up with a great plan, man, to get ahead and put yourself above somebody else in your culture and gain a higher status. Good job. High five. And Paul's like, God loves to frustrate people's plans like that. That's God's wisdom. And again, he says, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are useless. This is a quote from Psalm 94. And the context around that psalm, that verse in Psalm, is that people have, again, all these ideas. Humans come up with these schemes and these plans and these ideas and these thoughts that they think are like so great. But they're thoughts that ultimately result in people becoming arrogant over how great of an idea they have, committing injustice oftentimes, because when you want to get ahead, oftentimes you have to step on a few other people to get there, or mistreat people, or take advantage of people financially or something. Like you have to do something, to climb up. You have to step on other people to get there, or things that afflict other people. And so those are that's the context of what the writer in Psalm 94 is dealing with, is people who come up with these great, arrogant plans at other people's expense again. And the psalmist concludes, like, that's just vapor. It's useless. It's here, and then it just disappears like a bubble that pops. And so Paul's saying, from God's perspective, these human ideas that are so great, take advantage of people, they're just vapor. They're so short-lived. God will bring about justice, and those things will not survive. He says in verse 21, so then no one is to be boasting in people. Boasting in people is pointless. And again, if you've been following us through 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, that is the main thing that the Corinthians are doing. They're saying, I follow the Apostle Paul, and so I'm better than you are. No, I follow Apollos because he came in and he was a lot better speaker. He really had a hold on Greek rhetoric. He knew how to explain things clearly, and he was persuasive. I don't follow Paul. Paul wasn't self-confident. He stumbled over his words. He wasn't that impressive. I follow Apollos. Clearly, I'm more enlightened. And then other people were coming in and throwing Peter in the mix. Well, Peter, he walked with Jesus for over 3 years. He was with Jesus, one of the 12, one of Jesus' closest 3 friends. He's a powerful leader in the church now. I don't follow these guys. I follow one of the original guys. I follow Peter. And then there were still factions of people that said, well, I follow Jesus. I don't follow just these human people. I follow Jesus. He's not with us now. He's back in heaven at the Father's right hand, but I follow him. And so they were trying to one-up each other by attaching themselves to different leaders. But they were boasting in people. And there's a lot of ways that maybe we brag, and it's all tied back to our connection with some person or how people perceive us. He's saying from God's point of view, like bragging, when that bragging is attached to how great you are or how great another person is, like it just doesn't last in God's sight. God's like, you're bragging about another dirt creature that I made from dust in the beginning, and like this is what you're bragging about. It doesn't measure up to God's wisdom. It's pointless. He says, for all things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, which is the Aramaic name for Peter, or the world or life or death or things present or things to come. All things belong to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. There's a lot of things that are in that statement. And Paul is saying, what you're doing is you're comparing yourselves with each other. Who follows a better leader? Who has more spiritual gifts? Who has more wealth? Who is better? And what you don't realize is you all have been given a lot already. One, you all have a relationship with me. You all have a relationship with Apollos. You all know of Peter, and he's impacted your life in different ways. Not only that, you have this world. You have life. You're all going to have death someday. You have lots of things presently, and you're supposed to share them as a church, your community, and so you're supposed to use your excess to help other people out. But also, you've been promised an eternity, not only in heaven with God, but that someday God would resurrect your bodies back to life, and that he will come and either completely change and restore or remake this world into a place where God and humans will live and work side by side and partner to cultivate the world forever. And you all inherit all those things. So if you all have all those things already, you're kind of all on the same level and in the same boat. So how can you possibly compare yourselves with each other? Because you've all been given like an infinite amount of things by the fact that you belong to Jesus Christ. With your faith in Jesus came all those things as gifts, and you all already have all those things. So if you're comparing yourselves with one another, you're just comparing yourselves with the same thing ultimately. If you could really see from God's perspective, you would see that there aren't a lot of differences between you because you all have these things. And not differences that would make one person better than another because you all have these greater things in like an infinite supply. He's just pulling them out into God's perspective and saying, if you really thought of things the way God thinks of things, you'd see comparing yourselves with each other is kind of pointless. It's kind of foolish. He says, this is the way any person is to regard us as servants of Christ and stewards or caretakers of the mysteries of God. And so now he's getting back to the big problem, which is they're taking sides and saying, I follow one leader, so I'm better than you are because you follow a different leader. And he's saying, in God's wisdom, people look at leaders as servants of Christ. They're not anyone special. The fact that I'm up here right now, the only difference between you and I right now is the fact that I'm standing on this piece of wood that's like 1.5 feet taller than you, and you're sitting in a comfortable, cushy chair. That's the only difference. As God sees us, we're exactly the same. It doesn't matter that I'm a pastor at a church. we are all in Christ, and we're all on the same level playing field, and we're all servants of Christ. And other people that are up here that might be leading, Gene, who came up earlier, who's one of our elders, we're all on the same level. We're all serving Christ together. And we're all trying to be good caretakers of what God has given us and what God has revealed to us. Okay, that nothing more and nothing less. So trying to brag and boast is so contrary to the way that God's wisdom operates, where we just see each other as servants of Christ, and we see each other as people who all share in a huge inheritance through our faith in Jesus Christ. And those things are enough to take away any kinds of differences that might cause us to compete with one another. If we compete and we get jealous and we get boastful, like we're just short-sighted. We're not seeing things the way God sees things. And then the second and the last thing, the other side of that coin of humility, is not judging people, not thinking less highly of others who are fellow believers. Paul says, in this case, moreover, it's required of stewards that one be found trustworthy. He's talking about himself. He's a caretaker of God's truth, so to speak, of God's principles. And he says, it's important that I'm trustworthy, and if you're representing God, it's important that you're trustworthy as well. But he says, to me, it's an insignificant matter that I would be examined by you or by any human court. What's happening again is they're scrutinizing Paul, and they're trying to look into the details and figure out why Paul is either better than the other leaders or why he doesn't measure up. And so they're pitting Paul against Apollos and some of the other leaders that their churches had, and they're scrutinizing his life and all these details to figure out how good he really is or how bad he really is, and they're sizing him up. And he's saying, like, the fact that you're trying to assess me, like, I could care less. And even if a court of law called me, like if the Roman magistrate called me in and I had to stand on the judgment seat and the court assessed me, he's like, I could care less. And by this time that had happened to Paul multiple times. And so really, what's new? People are trying to figure out what they think of Paul. He's like, that doesn't matter to me. In fact, I don't even examine myself. He says, I don't even try to get into too much detail about judging myself, because, sometimes we get in this mode where we're just like, we're trying to scrutinize ourselves and evaluate ourselves so much, like, well, how do I measure up? Or what does God think of me? And Paul realizes, even when we know ourselves well, but we don't know ourselves the way God sees us. And so even if we hypothetically come to a conclusion of what God thinks about us, it's probably still going to be inaccurate because God has a better perspective. So he says, I don't even spend too much time like scrutinizing myself, because who knows if my perspective is even quite accurate from God's perspective. He says, for I'm not aware of anything against myself, so like I'm not consciously aware of these issues that I have. However, I am not vindicated by this. Just because I'm not aware doesn't mean like everything is good between God and I. He says, but the one who examines me is the Lord. So there's a couple things at play here. In talking about the fact that he doesn't care how other people perceive him, what other people's opinions of him are, that's a Stoic philosophy. John, who's our in-resident philosopher, like, if you want to know about Stoicism, talk to him. I am like very amateur level, and he knows a lot more, and he can talk your ear off if you want to find out more about these different philosophical schools of thought in ancient Greece. But from what little I've learned with Stoicism, part of the idea is, again, I'm trying to distance myself I'm trying to control everything. So I'm controlling my emotions, I'm controlling what really weighs on my mind, and so I'm exercising self-control to tell myself, I don't really care what other people think. I will not be affected by other people's opinions. And some people have read this and thought, well, that's what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to be really stoic in here. He's not really trying to be stoic, because what he's saying is, I'm not concerned about humans' opinions, but I'm really concerned about what the Lord thinks of me. So it's not utter stoicism where he says, I could care less what anyone thinks of me. He just says, I could care less what humans think about me, but I could care a lot about what God thinks about me. God's opinion of Paul is, at the base level, what really matters. God's opinion is what matters kind of at a base level. I'm not saying he doesn't care about people, but when he's assessing himself, he's not constantly worried about what other people think. And maybe that's something that you struggle with. I've had times where I've struggled with how people perceive me or trying to please people or what image, I'm giving off. And maybe it's refreshing for you to realize, like Paul realizes, people can come to all kinds of false assumptions about you and wrong opinions and conclusions. And even sometimes you come to wrong conclusions about yourself and how God views you. But ultimately, it's God's opinion of you that matters. And God not only knows you deeply, but he loves you perfectly. And so there's a lot of things, he knows you better than you know yourself. And as we'll find out in a moment, he knows what your motives are. He knows all of that. And he sees you for who you truly are, even more than you really see yourself at times. And so Paul's saying, again, I'm not really concerned with how other people judge me. He's going to move on. And again, how do people judge him really quickly? Many of the Corinthians think Paul's a poor leader. He lacks wisdom. He lacks confidence. He can't speak well in public. So that's how they've assessed him. Paul says, I care about what God thinks about me, and I'm kind of setting aside those opinions of who I am as a person. And then verse 5 goes on. It says, therefore, do not go on passing judgment before the time. And this is kind of like the core of his advice about not judging to the Corinthians. Don't go on passing judgment before the time. And he says, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of human hearts, and then praise will come to each person from God. I think these are worth maybe going back to, plastering on your wall, whatever you do, to remember stuff in life. When you get to the point of getting judgmental of people, I think these verses, they bring us back to kind of the reality that we should be focused on. These are great verses in a nutshell. And I think what they're trying to lead us to is this conclusion that as a general rule, passing judgment on another believer is out of place. As a general rule. And I do say there are some specifics because Paul deals with that, and we'll get into that more in a couple of weeks. But what he's saying is, now is not the time. Don't go on passing judgment, which they're doing all the time on each other and on Paul, before the time. But he says, wait until the Lord comes. So Paul's implication is, don't you assess people and figure out what God thinks of them. Just wait till Jesus shows up and let him do it. Because he's the one who has the right to judge. And Jesus had a conversation in John chapter 5, and he was saying, the Father has given all judgment to the Son. And he was talking about himself as the Son. So God has given Jesus the responsibility of judging people, not me and not you, in a large general sense. Thirdly, there are hidden details and unseen motives, and these verses talk about that. Whenever people make decisions, whenever you and we make decisions all the time, there's always a detail that you don't know. There's always details of your decisions that I don't know. And we really don't know what's motivating that. For example, as a family, we have experienced people misinterpreting different things that have been shared on social media. For example, my wife or I will make a comment on someone's post, and people will read it, and they'll think, oh, I know what's going on here. And maybe they'll work out these, if this means this, then there's that, and there's that. And pretty soon they've constructed a whole idea of why we said what we said and what was motivating it. And it's strayed really, really far from reality. Because with those types of things, there's always something hidden that people don't know. There's a context. There's a relationship. There's the way we define certain words and the way we talk to people in our lives. And then there's what motivates it, right? Is it motivated by something negative, or is it motivated by something positive, by something loving, or, are we just selfish people? There's always so much that's into it. And whether it's a social media post or a text message or a conversation, there's just so much room for reading each other wrong. So much information that we lack. But Jesus doesn't lack that. And so when he assesses us, it's accurate. But when we assess other people, we're always missing important pieces of the puzzle. And Paul says ultimately, Praise will come to each person from God. Why are we living life? Are we living life to get other people's approval? Or are we living life to gain God's approval? Romans chapter 14 is another great place to look if you want to explore these issues more. But Paul essentially says everybody stands and falls to their own master. And he's not talking about a slave master, and he's not talking about other people. He's talking about God. And so as we serve, we are servants of Christ. You are, I am. If we're following Jesus, we're serving Christ. Christ is our master. And so the decisions that we make and the motives that we have, we answer to him ultimately. And so as a general rule, whenever we get into a position of trying to judge each other and assume people's motives and why people are doing what they're doing and the way things look, we always get into problems as a general rule. There are a couple of exceptions. And again, we'll talk about that. So if you're looking at me like, I don't know that I agree with that, just give me a couple weeks and we'll talk about maybe some times when that might be important. But that's, again, a general rule for the Corinthians and for us if we want to try to keep a good handle on humility. Let me go ahead and wrap things up. He finishes in verse 6 and 7. He says, now these things, brothers and sisters, I have figuratively applied to myself and Apollos on your account, so that in us you may learn not to exceed what's written, so that no one of you will become arrogant on behalf of one against the other. So there's a few things in here, some statements that Christians and scholars have debated over the centuries, for like 2 millennia have debated on what exactly Paul is talking about. But it seems like kind of on the foundational level, Paul is saying a lot of these things that I just told you about wisdom and about not boasting and about not judging, I've given you illustrations from how Apollos, this other leader in your church that you've kind of pitted against me and been comparing me with, I've given you illustrations about how we have applied God's wisdom, each of us, and how we have navigated things and worked together as one, even though you're trying to use us against each other. Like I've shown you positive illustrations about how we have applied God's principles to operate by his wisdom, to not boast, to have a humble opinion, to not judge each other. And that's the example that I'm trying to put forth. And so when it says, I want you to learn not to exceed what is written. That's the phrase that people don't have a great handle on. But I think given the context of what Paul's talking about in the letter, I guess if I had to stand on a certain explanation of it, my explanation would be that he's cautioning the Corinthians not to exceed these principles that he's been sharing throughout his letter already that are rooted in the Hebrew Bible. He's quoted 4 or 5 different places in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible at this point about God's wisdom and how it works. And what I think he's doing is he's saying, God's given you these principles about how his wisdom operates, and so don't go beyond that into creating your own sort of wisdom. Look at how Apollos and I apply those principles in our lives, some of the stories we've shared to show you how we use God's principles of wisdom, and let that guide you. Don't come up with your own ideas of what wisdom is. That would be my explanation. However, different people would have different points of view. Some people would say this is saying that, don't go beyond anything that's written in the Bible. And other people would say this is talking about the book of life. Don't make assumptions or judge people based on the things they're doing, because only God is keeping track of all the details in his book, so to speak. So only he has the correct perspective. There's different interpretations, but that's kind of where I would line up. And I had some slides too, just that show these different quotations, but I won't spend a lot of time on that, and different principles, like Paul and Apollos, relying on God's wisdom, not human wisdom. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 19 is an Old Testament quote that brings that out. Just a couple of other things as well. They're boasting in their relationship with God, not their wisdom and strength and wealth. They're not comparing themselves. And there's an Old Testament quote that he quotes in 1 Corinthians 1:31 and so on. So again, just my explanation of what he might be talking about when he says don't go beyond the things that are written. These places from the Hebrew Bible that he's quoted in his letter to the Corinthians. There's another one that's an Old Testament quote as well. So the way that Paul ends up are just with these kind of like open-ended questions. And so that's where I want to end up with us this morning, actually. He asks them questions to help them evaluate if they're being boastful, if they're being judgmental, or not? And he simply says, first, who considers you as superior? That's an open-ended question. And I think that can be looked at on several levels. Does God consider you as superior to each other? Do other people in your church think that you're superior, you're better than they are? If so, why? Is that good? Have you been trying to get them to conclude that you're superior to them? Maybe the answer is no. No one considers me superior. Is that a good thing because you've been humble? Is that a bad thing because other people are measuring themselves against you and making themselves look better and concluding that you're worse? What's going on there as a church? Do you have this idea that some people are better than others? Because that doesn't really match with the fact that God has given you all such an amazing inheritance in Jesus Christ. Secondly, what do you have that you didn't receive? I could see people thinking about their spiritual gifts or their wealth or their status or their wisdom or their public speaking ability. And I think Paul would say, all these things that you're boasting in, where'd you get that? Was it your greatness that just made that show up? Or was it just something that maybe you were born with or you had the ability to cultivate? And by the way, why are you breathing right now? Why do you have the body that you have? Did you just make that happen? Did you create that? Or were you made and were you created? By your parents on a biological level, but by God, in maybe a universal, more comprehensive level. Why do you have life and breath anyway? Why do you have all the things that you have? Why do you have the health that you need to work for the things that you have? Why do you have the personality that you have? Why do you have the physical makeup that you have? Did you earn it or did you get it? And if you did receive it, why do you brag you're the person that made yourself into this thing that you are? So again, he's trying to help them see who they are and have a more humble view of themselves, I think. And I think that one of the big problems they wrestle with is humility. And maybe for us, that's something that we wrestle with. Maybe our tendency is to often compare ourselves with other people, to measure ourselves against other people, and to want to come out on top, to tell ourselves why we're better than other people in our lives. And if that's the case, it's a very divisive thing within a church community. Or maybe on the other hand, we're too hard on ourselves sometimes when we evaluate ourselves. And then the other thing is judgment. Is our default being too judgmental? Because that really is great for relationships. When you have people that are always trying to find flaws in you, you just want to be in a community with them, right? And yet that's the way that the church had become in Corinth. And so that's another side of humility, is reserving judgment for Jesus, who sees people and the hidden things and the motives and the details we don't know completely, and allow him to make the assessments. Unless, as we'll find in a couple of weeks, very specific things are being done really to cause harm. So that's how we wrap up things today.